All right, everyone, it's time to talk about some Senate races. Now, I'm going to go a little bit into some depth about the people, why these particular races do matter, why they're interesting. I'm not going to go into every Senate race, though. I believe that aren't there like 10 or 12 different races that are technically competitive, some more than others. One of these isn't competitive so much as it's an interesting experiment to see what's happening within the Democratic Party, because it's California, because of their jungle primary system. There's actually no Republican in the race. So the Republicans can't gain a seat there simply because, well, there's no Republican on the ballot. And it'd be a miracle if that happened. But I'm going to analyze some of these races and sort of the general polling there. First and foremost is Rick Scott, who's up 4 points over Nelson. Nelson being a Democratic incumbent, embattled, not particularly well known, whereas Rick Scott, he's got quite a bit of name recognition. Now, we've got to understand with Rick Scott, he's not really a dedicated MAGA populist. He's not really a dedicated Trump populist figure. He's more of an old school neocon. He's a drug warrior, sort of a police state lover, sort of a jackboot Republican. I don't even like the dude, but I still hope he wins because, look at what the alternative is. It's one of those races where you got to hold your nose, essentially. I don't think there's any viable independent running. Or, some of these races, you got to realize there is no third-party individual even running in many cases. Outside of presidential elections, that is. Or maybe gubernatorial office. A lot of times, Senate and House, you find that there's no real third-party presence for the most part. Big mistake, by the way, to third parties for not focusing on those first. But Rick Scott, I would say, is favored at the moment to beat the Democratic incumbent. That's a big victory. That's one that the Republicans have focused on. And we've got to look at polling. For all of these, we've got to look at what happens during August because no Senate incumbent is going to be able to campaign in the month of August. McConnell removed their, basically their, late summer break, their recess. Said, hey, we've got all sorts of appointees and a budget to pass. We got work to do, so you can't have your month-long vacation on the taxpayer dime. Now, I agree with that decision. It was partisan because 6 embattled Democrats but only 1 Republican incumbent are affected by this. And then the rest, those are really the races to fixate on. There's a couple here that maybe are less competitive than others. But the Scott versus Nelson race is definitely key. That's one of the most important. Another is in Missouri, and this is McCaskill versus Hawley. Now, Hawley is the Republican challenger. McCaskill is a relatively well-known Democrat, more of a moderate Democrat, by the way, as well, because you got to realize this is Missouri. This is a red state, essentially. People tried to claim it was a swing state in the last election. I'm like, no, it's not a swing state. It's going to stay red. It's probably going to get more red over the next decade. It's one of the states that's moving in that direction, much like maybe an Ohio or an Indiana, and it appears maybe even like a Wisconsin now. They're moving in the other direction. It's the Southwest states and maybe the Pacific Northwest that are, and Colorado, of course. Those are becoming more blue. The Rust Belt and down into sort of the Grain Belt region, it's becoming more partisan and red. McCaskill's down 2 points. With Hawley is up 2 points. And partially because Trump is decently well-liked in Missouri. It's a more red state. It leans towards red. Not, it's not Texas or something, but it's in that direction. I would say there's a 60-40 chance probably the Republicans grab the seat for McCaskill, and that would be the biggest victory they can really hope for. I would have said Tammy Baldwin, but she's ahead 9 points. I'll talk about that as well. That looks like it may be out of reach. Barring really, really good next job numbers and an immediate peace in North Korea and a bunch of other things, Trump's just not going to be able to deliver Tammy Baldwin's head on a platter to the Republicans in the Senate. But he can deliver McCaskill. He can go down there and campaign. He probably will. She'll probably win by 3 or 4 points. Fucking Hawley will win by 3 or 4 points. McCaskill gets knocked out. She's the most recognizable Democrat that's vulnerable other than Tammy Baldwin. So I would say probably there's a good chance of that. It's not as surefire as Rick Scott versus Nelson. That's like an 80-20 possibility. Rick Scott could tank by 3 or 4 points and they could be dead even on the same day, but polling, it's skewed, maybe in a Democratic direction, all things considered at some times. It's more likely than that it's skewed the other way, at the very least. Then we have Texas. This is one that the Democrats really wanted. They thought, hey, Ted Cruz is vulnerable because he's got ties to Trump. Let's hitch our campaign together to the slogan, "We're not Trump," and see what happens in Texas. This is also a symbol for those of you who are claiming up and down Texas is going to go blue. Once you see the result, because Cruz is ahead 9 points, he's not even particularly well liked. Even within his own state. His approval's not particularly high. His challenger is a charismatic individual, and yet he's 9 points ahead. He'll probably be 10 to 12 points ahead. The Democrats, this would be as likely to go the Democrats' way as Tammy Baldwin magically gets knocked off, despite, I believe, also being, 9 points ahead over Nicholson in Wisconsin, and that's the other race there. That one's important. Here you have a state Trump won, but that is primarily blue. What's the remnant Trump support there in Wisconsin, in a state that was very close? It looks like that is more weak, at least on the Senate level. I doubt that he'll go and bother trying to campaign there, despite the fact that there are pockets of considerable support there in Wisconsin. The same would be true all over the Rust Belt. Like Pennsylvania might be the odd man out. He led by a greater margin there. Michigan and Wisconsin, it was very close, all things considered. Then we've got to focus on something where there's no Republican at all, and that's the California Senate race between Dianne Feinstein, long-term neoliberal incumbent, extreme anti-gunner, otherwise basically just a corporate liberal, and actually De Leon, who represents a younger, more progressive candidate. She's up 20 points right now on like 2 polls, so we don't have accurate numbers. The slew of new polls that came out in the last couple of days didn't include that race, probably because it's self-evident she's going to win. We need to pay attention, though, to the margin. I hope they get at least 2 or 3 more polls. At the very least, in the final result, we've got to pay attention to it, and I'll tell you why. The De Leon vote represents the very, very angry core of the Democratic true liberals, whereas Feinstein represents everyone else. Every vote Dianne Feinstein doesn't get is a vote against unity within the Democratic Party, and shows what proportion, roughly, in a state that tends to be further left, it's solid blue. Well, the state of California's demographics, you're talking youth vote is very important. I'll have to analyze that too. What proportion of those voters refuse to vote for Dianne Feinstein, despite the fact that she's got the backing of the entire corporate liberal apparatus of the entire country? She's an old firebrand within the party. She's probably demented now, but she's very recognizable. She is one of the most recognizable Democratic names and faces. A boogeyman, a bad dream of the far right, really, to technically speaking. De Leon is maybe more moderated on actually some of these issues, including, I believe, guns. However, he is still the further left candidate on fiscal issues and on things like that. He doesn't have the corporate entanglements. He's also several decades younger. He's again, sort of the charismatic candidate. What proportion of people, especially young people within the Democratic Party, are going to vote for him? That's what we have to look at. Some of his votes will come from Republicans, but then again, because he's further left economically, I would say it's just as likely they'll end up voting for Feinstein. A lot of them will probably just not vote. If you've got a Democrat versus a Democrat and you're a partisan Republican who never votes for anything that doesn't have an R after its name, yeah, you're probably not voting for either of them. You're probably staying home and you're watching election analysis by Styx Hexenhammer, which, by the way, is a very good thing to do. But this is just some poll analysis. We still have to wait. Right now, and consistently I've said this, the Republicans are favored. They're going to keep the Senate. They'll probably gain a few seats. If they work really hard, they could gain 4. If they gain more than that, then it'll be a really, really great day for them. In the House, they've basically said, well, we're going to lose support in the House. It's just a matter of can we hold on by the skin of our teeth to a majority there, however slight. I think they can. The new jobs numbers and the new economic markers and the fact that more progress is being made in Korea, I believe will buoy their support further. All this like Trump-Cohen tapes and stuff, people have lost interest in it. I don't even bother talking about half of these things when they happen. If it's a major development in the Mueller probe, okay, it's newsworthy. Otherwise, Trump asked for a Coca-Cola. I don't care. Nobody gives a fuck about that unless they're already so deranged about Trump, it's guaranteed they're going to vote for the Democrats. No one's going to change their mind. What you've got to look at is undecided voters, and I think personally that they have gotten tired of the Trump derangement fake outrage, which is what it tends to be. And they're saying the Democrats are really overstretching here. The only thing standing in their way of casting their ballot for the Republicans situationally is whether that individual Republican has done something shitty within their state for the most part. That would, I think, hold back someone like Rick Scott more than anybody else. Again, he's not even really part of the MAGA movement. He's an old neocon. He predates the Trump era by a long distance. Now, as far as the Feinstein-De Leon race, though, that's the one I'm actually most interested in. Like, it'll be interesting to see, how much does Cruz win by in Texas? Does McCaskill lose her job? Does Tammy Baldwin look really weak and only win by a point or two? What happens in these races? Really fun. But the big one is really Democrat versus Democrat, that we should be fixated on the Democratic schism going on right now. That plays into every other aspect of U.S. politics. The Republicans' midterm chances, really, they hinge on, hey, we need higher turnout than the Democrats, generally speaking. In order to retain the House, we need to be underestimated by a point or two in these polls. We need the congressional generic ballot to narrow, and we need to fixate in the Senate on specific races. In the House, it's harder to do that. There's too many of them because polling can be so scattered. Sometimes you got one poll in a 6-month period. You're trying to analyze or predict a race. Good fucking luck. You might as well just flip a coin to decide who you think is going to win if you don't have enough polling behind it. Thankfully, we've got more polling for some of these, like Scott versus Nelson. There's enough there to say, yes, Rick Scott indeed is ahead by 4 or 5 points. That's a healthy lead considering who Rick Scott is. He's against an incumbent. Incumbents do tend to have a slight advantage over challengers. It's just the structure. It's just the name of the game. Therefore, when I see McCaskill especially, higher powered, at least a second-rung powerful Democrat, someone maybe comparable to an Al Franken in name recognition, when I see she may lose her job, that doesn't show strength within the Democratic Party, even if it is in a state like Missouri. That's about all. Peace out.